All right, so thank you everyone for having me. My name's Sam Wimpenny, and I'm a postdoc in Leeds at the moment. And really, I came across the topic of sort of rift inheritance fortuitously. My main interest is in fault mechanics. But what I'm going to talk to you about today is actually some work that I did looking at the Andes, where I was really interested in trying to quantify the mechanical properties of faults, but it actually turned out to provide some sort of slightly new insights into the role that fault mechanics plays in governing the growth and evolution of mountain ranges, and in particular the role of pre-existing faults that were formed during rifting that predated the Andean shortening along the western margin of South America. So this is going to be a sort of geophysics talk. It's very big picture and very zoomed out. It's very different to the typical detail that people might look at structural inheritance from structural geology or mapping, for example. But what I'm going to do is use earthquake data sets, so a data set of very large or moderate magnitude earthquakes, and I'm going to use some very simple physical arguments to try and convince you that faults play an important role in mountain building, and they also are surprisingly weak. So here's just the kind of study region, or part of the study region. In the background, what you've got is a hillshade, a DEM of the central Peruvian and southern Peruvian Andes. And we've got the Pacific Ocean off to the west, and we've got the Brazilian Shield out to the east. And active shortening is taking place along the eastern margin of the mountain belt in this region in various different styles. So the reason why the Andes is particularly interesting is because the style of shortening varies significantly along its eastern margin from north to south, often in kind of confusing ways. So here in central Peru, there's this region known as the Shira Uplift. This is a region of crystalline basement rock that's been exhumed to the surface along active, steeply dipping reverse faults. So this is typically what we might call a thick-skinned style of deformation, although I'm not really going to focus too much on the differences today. And then if we move further south into the margins of the Peruvian altiplano, what we see is a shift to a different style of shortening, where we've got these kind of long worm-like anticlinal ridges along the margins of the mountain belt. And these are generally spaced by less than 5 kilometers, up to 10 kilometers, some cases. So these are telling us these are really just folding of the cover sediments on the edge of the fallen basins. This is what we call a thin-skin style of shortening. And this was pretty obvious back in the 90s and then well before that too. And this is just a paper from Tony Watts sort of summarizing in a cartoonish way what the differences are in the deformation style between these two regions. So what I was really interested in doing is looking at earthquake data sets to see whether that's going to tell us anything more about what's controlling these different styles of deformation. And the reason why the earthquakes are important is because they're telling us what's really going on beneath the cover sediments. Okay, so when we look at structural geology, a lot of the time what we're seeing is deformation controlled by the top sort of 5-10 kilometers of the crust, whilst when we look at the earthquakes, particularly in the Andean fold, what we can really see is the deformation that's taking place within the mid and the lower crust. Okay, so the first thing that I actually spent quite a while doing was quite carefully modeling the mechanisms and the centroid depths of earthquakes in the Eastern Andes. And this is generally a pretty simple method. So this is just an example of trying to determine the centroid depth of an earthquake and do that using surface reflected earthquake depth phases. So the P wave leaves the source, it travels all the way to a receiver. And then there are depth phases that travel up, reflect off the surface, and also travel to the receiver. And the differential travel time between the two tells us something about the depth of the earthquake. And typically, we can determine that to within a couple of kilometers. We can also match the shapes of the waveforms to determine the orientations of the nodal planes of the focal mechanism, and therefore say something about the orientation of the faults that ruptured in these earthquakes. And typically did this for about 50 new earthquakes in the magnitude range of about 5 up to about magnitude 7 and a bit. So we're looking at big earthquakes that are really accommodating the vast majority of the seismogenic deformation of the crust, because they're going to be the important things for telling us about strain and the depth distribution of deformation. So if we actually do that all the way along the strike of the mountain range from north to south, what we get is a map that looks something like this. So on the left, what we have are the earthquake focal mechanisms, and they're colored by different mechanism types. So the brown is strike slip, the green is reverse faulting earthquakes, the blue is normal faulting earthquakes out in the foreland associated with bending, and the pink are low angle thrusts that typically earthquakes with nodal plane dips on the low angle plane less than about 10 degrees. On the right, in the middle here, we have the centroid depths in kilometers of each of these earthquakes. And on the right, what we have is a sort of cross-section in depth through the seismicity. So that's kind of summarizing the depth distribution of earthquakes at different latitudes along the mountain range. So I'm just going to describe some of the key features here. There's kind of a lot of information in this map. But if we first take a look along the strike of the mountain range, if we start off up here in the northern Andes, in Venezuela and Colombia, what we can see is that most of the seismicity is sort of confined onto the edge of the mountain belt. So right where the steep topography meets the fallen basin, that's where we see most of the big earthquakes. There's some earthquakes out in the foreland here, and they're mostly associated with normal faulting as the foreland bends in response to the loading of the Andes. And these are interesting in their own right, but I won't talk much more about them today. In Ecuador, we also see a sort of similar pattern. Most of the earthquakes are confined to the edge of the high topography, maybe just slightly into the foreland. And then if you move into central and northern Peru, what you can see is a slightly different pattern. The deformation actually starts to become more distributed. There are large earthquakes beneath the high topography on the edge of the mountain range. But there's also large earthquakes in the foreland itself, beneath the relatively flat topography of the foreland basin. So this is one interesting feature. We can also see a similar thing happening down here in Argentina, where we've got very distributed seismicity in this area known as the Sierra Pampeanas, a region where we've got large basement uplifts that are distributed over sort of 300, 400 kilometers away from the range front. And then that narrows down again as we move northwards into this region known as the Santa Barbara Ranges. So we've got clear along strike variability in the width of the deforming zone at the edge of the mountain range. There's also some interesting variability in the frequency of earthquakes. So here around the Altiplano, we can see that there are very few earthquakes in the foreland, whilst here in central Peru and in Argentina, there's lots of earthquakes, more seismogenic deformation. And if you sum the moment released from these earthquakes, you also get more equivalent seismic strain in these regions. So it's telling us there's something varying too in terms of the mechanisms by which the edge of the mountain belt is deforming. If we look at the depth distribution, what we can see is that the seismicity extends all the way pretty much from about 5 kilometers, which is near the base of the sediment layer in most places, down to pretty much the base of the crust. So the crust in this region is between 40 and by about 35 to 45 kilometers thick. These little gray triangles in the background are MOHO depth estimates from receiver function analysis. And what we can see is that pretty much everywhere where there's lots of earthquakes, the seismicity extends from the surface down to the base of the crust in a single layer. There's no evidence that there are any gaps in these layers. There are no evidence, and bearing in mind that these are just the centroid representations and the faults actually have finite size and they dip through the crust. The simplest interpretation of these observations is that you just have a single seismogenic layer, which is roughly equivalent to the thickness of the crust along the edge of the Andes. That's particularly clear in places like this in central Peru. We can see there is some variability in the depth to which you get earthquakes. So here in central Peru, they go down to about 45 kilometers. Here in Ecuador, they're a little bit shallower. They go down to about 30 kilometers. So that's obviously going to be important and interesting when we think about what role pre-existing faults might play in controlling the deformation, because we've got variability in the thickness of the brittle layer. So that might relate to variability in the strength of that layer, if that's the thing that supports most of the stress acting through the lithosphere. Okay, so once I actually put those earthquake observations together, the next question was what's actually controlling these along strike patterns? We could see that there was variability in the width of the deformation zone. There was also variability in the number of earthquakes you see. And to sort of cut a long story short, what I did was quite simply plot up the positions of the large basin-bounding Mesozoic rift normal faults that come from the mapping of Victor Ramos and others. And then put that underneath the earthquake depth distribution. That's what we can see on the left. So each one of these dots is an earthquake. The pink ones are deep earthquakes, greater than 25 kilometers centroid depth, and the yellow ones are shallow ones. What we can see is that in the regions where we have distributed seismicity, i.e. the earthquakes extend away from the range front, we've got distributed normal faults here, and the rifts lie along the margin of the range front. Whilst where we've got very little seismicity, or the size like here around the Altiplano, the rifts are actually internal to the mountain range, and the edge of the mountain belt that's currently deforming, either foreland, was unrifted in the Mesozoic. And where the deformation is very confined to the edge of the range front, like up here in the northern Andes, most of these pre-existing rift-related normal faults lie along the range front. So that's telling us that these pre-existing faults are controlling the distribution of seismicity. So the next question I had was, okay, can we say anything about the mechanics of these faults? Fortunately, we can do this in the Andes because we have a very useful configuration of deformation. So what we actually have is that in the top of the Andes, we have normal faulting, and that normal faulting is roughly parallel to the orientation of the shortening in its fallens. So that means we can treat the deformation roughly as plane strain. We can treat it in two-dimensional cross-section. So most of the deformation is within that section. And we can also say that the buoyancy forces acting on the mountain range, which are created by differences in gravitational potential energy between the mountain belt and its fallens, which is something that we can calculate, exceed the forces acting through the fallen lithosphere. Okay, so that allows us to place a bound on the horizontal force that's actually acting through the fallen lithosphere because we can calculate this buoyancy force. So what I'm going to do is show you some calculations on the next slide. And these basically just include gravity and some information about the density structure, the moho depth, and the lithosphere thickness in the fallens and the mountain range. So here are the results of those calculations. On the left, what we can see are some histograms of the buoyancy force in different parts of the Andes.
Sam,
and each one of these, yep.
You used about 10 minutes now.
Okay, no worries. Nearly done. What we have are the histograms. These ones in sort of sandy colors represent those in the northern Andes, and they typically are associated with a buoyancy force between about 3 and 4 teranewtons per meter. And these histograms over here to the right are slightly higher buoyancy forces associated with the south and the central Andes, which are slightly higher in elevation relative to the foreland, where you have buoyancy forces of about 5 to 7 teranewtons per meter. Okay, so that allows us to place this upper bound on the horizontal force that's acting through the fallen lithosphere. And what we could see on the previous slides was that the seismicity was telling us that this fallen lithosphere, at least the seismogenic part of it, was breaking up in earthquakes pretty much throughout its whole thickness. So that's telling us that the force acting through the fallen lithosphere has to be large enough to break those faults. Okay, otherwise, if the faults were too strong, they just wouldn't break. The fallen lithosphere would have underthrust beneath the mountain range. And that seems to be what's happening around the Altiplano, where we've just got wholesale underthrusting of the fallens. We've got thin skin deformation at the surface. But in the regions where the seismogenic layer is breaking up, which is shown by these dots on the right, outside of this ellipse, what we can see is that the seismogenic thickness, that's the thickness of the seismogenic layer, correlates with the height of the mountain range, which is what we'd expect if you had essentially the faults were supporting the mountain belt, the height of the mountain belt. Because the thicker the seismogenic layer, the deeper the faults go, the more force they can transmit into the mountain range, the higher the mountain range can be. This is the relationship between the two is consistent with the faults supporting having a kind of effective coefficient of friction of about 0.1, or certainly less than 0.2. So that's extremely unusual. It's much, much lower than typically determined from laboratory experiments on dry rocks. It's much lower than we would expect if we were including the effects of hydrostatic pore fluid pressure in dry rocks. So really what we've moved from is a picture here on the left, where we had this kind of cartoonish sketch where we could definitely see there were different deformation styles, but we didn't really know what this meant for, or what was controlling this, or what the mechanical properties of the lithosphere was. I think the earthquake data tells us, so updates our picture to what we have on the right here, where we've got this thick skin deformation. The earthquake data tell us that these pre-existing normal faults inherited from these old rift zones, which are frictionally weak and still able to generate earthquakes despite their protracted histories of deformation, are really the things that are controlling the deformation style in areas that have this kind of thick-skinned whole crustal deformation. Where we don't have those rifts, the lithosphere seems to just be underthrusting the mountain range wholesale. And that's just because it's too strong to break up in response to the forces acting between the fallens and the mountain range. And it's now being detached along some weak horizon that's taking up the deformation, like the decollement beneath the Altiplano and the Puna Plateau. Okay, so I'll end there. I'll leave those conclusions up, and then if anybody's got any quick questions, I'll take those now.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Sam. We have time for just a couple of questions. If you have any question, please feel free to unmute and ask Sam your question.
Hi, Sam. This is Derek. I have a question.
Hello.
Yeah, I just wondered if there are any constraints on the shape of the fault subsurface, like the geometry, and how that changes along the Andes. Like, because I guess your summary models, the key difference between the end members are the dip angle of the thrust.
Yeah. So I mean, the seismological methods that I've used to determine the focal mechanisms are all based on point source assumptions. So we don't get any direct information out of those about the change in the dip angles. If you just plot a histogram of the dip angle differences between different sections, you get more high angle faults, or more closely clustered around 45 degrees in places like central Peru and the Sierra Pampeanas. But there's no sort of high resolution microseismicity data, for example, that have been able to map out fault structure in any way that I know of. There's some work that people have been doing in looking at using geodesy in the Sierra Pampeanas to try and look at fault structure more closely, for recent big earthquakes, coupling that with microseismicity. But yeah, not in this study that I've done. It's all pretty broad brush, just looking at where do you have high angle reverse faults, stuff close to 45 degrees, nodal plane dips, and where do you have low angle thrusts. That's really all I've done, but other people have.
Brilliant, thanks.